they went out and they collected, I think it was Katie first, went and collected a bunch of wild flies from 2 different populations with very different environments. So this was one in the state of Utah in the United States, kind of high up, mountainous area, and another set from Arizona, which is more desert, a little bit lowland. So she collected a big set of flies from there. Then Kieran then conducted a series of genetic crosses and genetic mapping to look at recombination rates. If it's more than expected, that suggests that natural selection might be involved. And it was a lot more than expected. So that was very, very strong evidence that natural selection is really important in driving this difference between natural populations of a species in recombination rate. And it was a huge, huge undertaking.
Hello everyone. Welcome to another segment of the series of interviews conducted by the Department of Chemistry, University of Colombo. I am Hashim Hiranya, a final year undergraduate following chemistry.
I am Jazra Jawahir, a final year undergraduate following biochemistry and molecular biology. Today we have with us none other than Professor Mohamed Noor. Professor Mohamed Noor is the Dean of Natural Sciences and a professor in the Biology Department at Duke University. Professor Noor received his undergraduate degree from the College of William and Mary and PhD in Ecology and Evolution from the University of Chicago, together with a postdoctoral residency at Cornell University. He served as editor-in-chief of the international journal Evolution and was an associate editor for several other journals and the author of over 100 publications. He has served as president of the American Genetic Association and Society for the Study of Evolution and as a board member for the Genetics Society of America. He has been recognized with numerous honors and awards, including the Stephen J. Gould Prize, Darwin Wallace Medal, Earl G. McLean Professorship, and Outstanding Postdoc Mentor Award, among many others.
Without further delay, let's welcome Professor Mohamed Noor. Hello, Professor. We warmly welcome you to this interview and thank you so much for giving us your precious time.
Thank you very much. Sorry.
So to begin with, I would like to know about your childhood and early education.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for that very generous introduction. That was very kind. So to answer your question, early childhood, I grew up in southeastern Virginia. My father was also a professor, though very different area. So he's in aerospace engineering. I always liked biology. I mean, I always liked, catching bugs outside and playing with them and things like that. And I enjoyed my biology classes. I remember very much in 7th grade taking biology and just being very excited about it. Interestingly, genetics was something that came to me later, even though that's an area in which I feel like I specialize now. I remember getting an F on a test in genetics in high school, but obviously I made up for it eventually. I mean, for me, the real turning point was in college. I started taking some introductory biology courses. The courses were okay. I mean, they were interesting, but they didn't fully grab me. But it was actually when I took genetics my junior year that it really grabbed me, just the logic to it, and I just really thought it was fascinating that we could do these things. So I subsequently signed up for a class called evolutionary genetics, and I used to sit in the front row and I just listened to it. Just loved it. I would record the class with a tape recorder, and when I'd go to exercise later, I'd just play it again just to hear it again, because it was so interesting. This combination of the mathematics to it, the logic to it, the long-term applications of genetics in terms of how things change over time. I loved it. But that's what really inspired me to go into this area, is really that class. And the professor who taught that class at William & Mary, his name was Professor Bruce Grant, who I'm still in touch with. He's long retired now, but I still hear from him all the time.
That's really interesting, Professor, to hear these things from you. We'll move on to our next question. Professor Noor, you obtained your PhD from University of Chicago in 1996 with a specialization in Drosophila evolution. So how did this experience mold your career path?
It very strongly molded it. One interesting connection is my PhD advisor was actually a student with that same professor at William & Mary, but 20 years before I was. So that was how I actually got connected with him, because that professor said, "Oh, you should go work with my former student Jerry Coyne. He's great." And he is great. He's actually very distinguished evolutionary biologist. He's also now retired too. Yeah, but I mean, the research I've been doing since that time very much follows from that. It's all been in Drosophila evolution more generally, but even some of the very specific projects. My first PhD student, his name was Daniel Ortiz Barrientos. He's now a faculty member at the University of Queensland in Australia. His dissertation project was a direct follow-up of my dissertation project, because what I was looking for is evidence for natural selection driving mate preference in Drosophila. What he then did is he essentially mapped, genetically mapped that trait that I've studied in graduate school. So very, very strong influence from there.
That's interesting, Professor. So let's move on to our next question.
Sure.
What sparked your interest to do science, and what inspired you to become a scientist?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, I've always liked science. I mean, I remember, in fourth grade, as a very young kid, I always liked, and not necessarily just biology. I mean, I was really into planets. I remember ever having this big book that was called like On Mars. I think it's still actually at my parents' house. I still flip through it occasionally. This was right after the Viking missions there to Mars. I remember thinking it was fascinating. I remember we went watching nature shows, and I mentioned earlier I'd play with insects outside. And again, my parents had a background in STEM, in science, technology, engineering, and math, so they very much encouraged it too. So just from there, everything just kept on rolling, and with, like I said, it being punctuated with that class as an undergraduate.
Really, it's interesting, Professor.
Thanks.
Now we would like to know some interesting facts about your research field. Recently, you did a research based on evolutionary genetics with Samo, Winkler, and Ritz in 2020. Also, you published a paper on the topic of natural selection shapes variation in genome-wide recombination rate in Drosophila pseudospora. So, what were your important research findings based on this research topic?
That's great. I'm really glad that you picked that paper, because I love that paper. It's so exciting. I remember when we first came up with the idea much earlier on. So let me set some of the backstory for it. Recombination, this sort of exchange of genetic material between chromosomes, is fundamentally important. If you don't have recombination, if you don't have exchange between say chromosomes, then what happens is you'll accumulate bad mutations, and it's very hard to put together combinations of good alleles together. So we know that recombination in general is good, like having some level of recombination is good. Now, what was less clear is there basically, if there's fine differences in recombination, does that matter? Let's say, for example, that between, say a set of genes, and I'll just use humans as an example. Let's say between a set of two genes, does it matter if the recombination frequency is 5% or 8%? Or is it just, the fact it's above 0 is good, but beyond that, it doesn't matter? Now, people have seen for a long time that there's differences in recombination rate across different parts of the genome, on different chromosomes, things like that. There's also differences in the same parts of chromosomes, but between species or between individuals. But is that something that matters, or is that just truly random? Now, people just assumed, of course it matters, and probably it's been driven by natural selection, but there was never a direct test for it. So what we did, and kudos to the people who really did the work. You mentioned them. Kieran Samuk was a postdoc at my lab. Katie Ritz was a graduate student. Brenda Manzano-Winkler is still my lab manager. She's still here. The others have moved on. Kieran's now a faculty member at UC Riverside, for example. They went out and they collected, I think it was Katie first, went and collected a bunch of wild flies from 2 different populations with very different environments. So this one in the state of Utah in the United States, kind of high up, mountainous area, and another set from Arizona, which is more desert, a little bit lowland. So she collected a big set of flies from there. Then Kieran conducted a series of genetic crosses and genetic mapping to look at recombination rates to see. The first question is there even a difference between these natural populations in different environments? And the answer was yes, there's a genetic difference, because we studied them in the same environment and we still see these differences in recombination frequency. What he then did is he then looked at genetic differences between them and said, based on the genetic differences we see between them, is that difference in recombination rate about as much as expected or more than expected? If it's more than expected, that suggests that natural selection might be involved. And it was a lot more than expected. So that was very, very strong evidence that natural selection is really important in driving this difference between natural populations of a species in recombination rate. And it was a huge undertaking. It took many, many years to conduct. And I remember when we got that final answer, I was like, oh, this is great. So very glad it worked out. And you know, I'm thrilled it's out there in the world now.
Glad to hear about them, Professor. So
Thanks.
question is, what is your experience about developing an undergraduate genetics and evolution course for the classroom and turning it into a massive open online course through Coursera?
That's a great question. So the class you're referring to is called Introduction to Genetics and Evolution. I initially, as you said, I was teaching it here at Duke University. And prior to teaching it here, we actually were doing a curricular revamp, and several of us faculty sat through a series of workshops on the most effective modes of teaching. And one of the things that came up in that was the advantage of using something that's referred to as a flipped classroom, which you may be familiar with this. The idea behind that is that normally what happens in a traditional class is, you know, the professor gets up there in the front, they deliver the material to the students write it all down, they go home and they work on problems. There's a thought that maybe that doesn't actually make so much sense, because the time that we're spending together is more content delivery rather than content application and integration. So the thought with a flipped class is, why not make it so that you're actually getting the content when I'm not there? Because, you know, whatever, that doesn't matter if I'm there or not. And then the time you're with me, we're doing problems and things like that. So I learned about this flipped class idea from that. And then the provost, the top academic officer in the university, asked me if I'd be interested in creating a MOOC, a massive open online class. And my initial reason for saying yes was just because of this flipped class idea. Because I said, well, if I record a bunch of videos, I can use those videos not just for the online students, but I can also use it for the Duke students and flip my class. So, you know, I went through the process of creating them and got a lot of help from an excellent technical person here named Justin Johnson, who's also moved on. And I was really, I mean, it's funny because I was interested in the MOOC aspect, but I didn't realize just what the uptake would be like. This is around the time when MOOCs first came out. I think Duke was kind of in that first or second wave of MOOCs out there. And the response was so positive. I mean, there were so many people out there who were like, wow, you know, I am, you know, a truck driver in Ireland and I don't have time to take a college class, but here I can learn about, you know, molecular evolution, you know, or whatever, you know, these very, very different circumstances for different people. And it was so heartwarming. So I didn't actually go into the MOOC. I mean, I went into, like, you know, being interested in doing that, but my focus was more on applying the flipped class here. But then seeing the impact on people, you know, around the world with the MOOC, it's just been heartwarming. And I still interact with it all the time. Actually, just this morning prior to getting on this interview, I was answering a student's questions in the MOOC because she's I don't know where she is, but you know, her name's Andrea or something. I was just answering some of her questions because she was stuck on a particular problem. But it's heartwarming just seeing this massive uptake for it. And I think at this point, you know, over 100,000 people have taken at least some part of it, and 70-some thousand have actually completed the course. It's amazing. And I did actually end up applying it here as a flipped class too, which was also very interesting, trying that very different dynamic of teaching than the traditional lecture format.
That's really interesting to hear those things, Professor. And also you are one of the top lecturers around the world who is teaching online, and the majority of the online students who are studying genetics and evolution through these online platforms such as Coursera are fans of your style of teaching. So what do you think is the reason for your success in this online teaching?
That's a very gracious way of putting it. Thank you so much. I credit to the workshops that we had early on, you know, about, you know, what are modes of effective teaching. It wasn't something that, you know, there's no natural talent to these things, right? I mean, people have to learn to do this. So it really helped having these workshops. And then there's a group here, the Center for Learning Innovation at Duke. I mean, they actually had a staff member who would work with me and say, no, don't make like 40-minute videos. Nobody wants to watch a 40-minute video. Make like a series of minute videos, break it down, and show it this way here, and here's the technology to help you do it. Here's like a giant iPad so you can draw on the screen. Those things were critical. Those things were critical. And I will say, I mean, it does help also to be an extrovert. As you can probably tell, I'm not introverted or shy at all. So that does help when you're teaching too. But really the training that my university provided me was enormously helpful in making the product be as good as it came out to be. I'm very honored that it seems to be doing pretty well too. So thank you.
Professor, you have been fortunate to receive several awards such as Stephen J. Gold Prize, Darwin Wallace Medal, and many more. So what led you to achieve those awards, and how have those awards helped you in furthering your research investigations?
People have been very, very gracious. I mean, the Gould Award, which you mentioned first, is from the Society for the Study of Evolution. It's for outreach to the broader community. And what they cited a couple of different things when they did it. Like, I've done a little bit of work with high schools, and not especially recently, but I have in the past done some work with high schools where we developed this kit for showing evolution by natural selection using Drosophila fruit flies. Basically, you essentially put in a mutation and then watch it spread through the population. I partnered with a local company called Carolina Biological Supply to make a kit so you could just order this and actually do it anywhere in the country or in the world. So that was really cool. And then we talked already about the massive open online class, but the third rung to that, which they highlighted, is, this is something I've been doing actually for fun, but it actually has been ending up pretty good, is I do a lot of public outreach talks at science fiction conventions. And what I do is I talk about genetics or evolutionary concepts, but I frame them using examples from popular culture. And the most common one that I use is Star Trek. This is the TV science fiction series. So I've been doing that now for over 5 years. And I actually have a YouTube channel which has all these videos teaching various concepts. That was actually something else I was working on right before this call, is something basically to teach some basic phylogenetics techniques using an illustration from a Star Trek episode. So that, I mean, it seems like people like it. I mean, there's some uptake to that, and I even wrote a book along those lines, which has done pretty well as well. So that's for that area. And then others, I mean, the other awards you mentioned, I mean, they've been for various different sorts of things. I mean, the Earl D. McLean professorship, which you mentioned, it's a mixture of research success and teaching. So I mean, I've had amazing students who've done amazing research, so that's really helped on the research side. And you heard one example, a recent example with the paper on recombination, and we talked a little bit about teaching as well. So I mean, altogether, it's just I work with great people, so that helps a lot.
Well explained, Professor. My next question is, according to your opinion, what are the important features that are critical to become a good scientist?
Yeah, so that's a great question. There's a lot of things. I mean, the thing that I love the most about the work that I do is the opportunity to sit down with other brilliant people and just brainstorm. I mean, there's no time that I'm happier in my job than when I'm sitting one-on-one with a grad student or postdoc or undergraduate, and we're just brainstorming, like, what could this be? Maybe it's this. It is so much fun. But I should also say that is critical to success. It's basically working with excellent people and diverse people, like not everybody coming from exactly the same background, but bringing different insights and different experiences. And there's many, many times when somebody would just make this passing comment like, oh, I never thought of that, and it really changes my perspective in a big way. There's many times when students have completely changed my point of view on something just by a passing comment that they make about, like, well, couldn't blah, blah, blah also be true? I'm like, oh my gosh, you're exactly right. So that's a huge one, is, again, like working with a broad thinking, diverse team is number one. Number two is, of course, carefulness, right? I mean, people sometimes will put something out there a little bit too quickly and it's sloppy. That will never advance the field. That will never advance your career. That will never advance anything. That is doomed to fail. So being very, very careful, very rigorous, good controls, really thinking through alternate interpretations of what one's doing, that's absolutely critical. And then third, as they always say, 80% of success is showing up. So effort is definitely in there as well. I don't think it's the number one thing. People used to say, like, oh, work harder, work harder. Yeah. I mean, there's a level where, like, work effort starts to plateau in terms of success because you exhaust yourself too much. So, but to an extent, I mean, you do have to work hard. You can't just work, 2 hours a week and then get a lot of things done.
Those are really useful, Professor. I think we have come to the end of the session. So my last question is, what kind of advice would you have for someone who may be interested in working in the field of science?
Best thing you can do, I think, is find good role models or good mentors and ask for the opportunity to work with them. So I mean, I mentioned the class before that I took in college, which was very foundational. The class was foundational, but what was really foundational wasn't so much the class, it was my interactions with that professor. It was basically then following the class, I then did a research project with him. I spent a lot of one-on-one time. This is as an undergraduate student. I spent a lot of one-on-one time with him, talking about science, talking about projects, talking about my future and things like that. There's no single thing that I think could have a bigger impact on somebody's success than finding a good mentor and having a lot of one-on-one time with them to, work on, basically like hands-on science and talk science and immerse yourself into science. And a lot of people get intimidated. They say, oh, I don't have enough of a background. No, I mean, if you're in college, just find a professor who does something that you like and just, ask them to coffee, ask them, just see what the opportunities are. Don't be shy because the expectations are not that high right off the bat. So yeah, find great mentors. That's definitely number one.
The advice you gave is really useful for us as budding scientist, Professor. Before we wrap up the things, is there anything else that you would like to add, Professor?
Oh, I think your questions were outstanding, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come chat with you all. I'm very honored that you asked me to do this. So thank you for having me. Thank you for having this lecture series. I actually watched some of your previous lectures. I saw you had my colleague, David Baratan from the chemistry department here as one of your previous guests too. I watched that one as well. But kudos to you for having this whole program. And again, thank you for having me on it too.
With that, the time has come to wind up the interview. We had a fascinating interview with you, Professor Noor. It was a great privilege and honor for us to interview you. Thank you on behalf of the Department of Chemistry, University of Colombo. We really appreciate that you were able to allocate your precious time to take part in this interview session. Professor Noor, thank you again and good luck in all that comes your way in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
With that, this interview will inspire and encourage young scientists who are willing to make their mark in the field of science. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Stay tuned with us to have more interviews with eminent scientists all around the world. Have a nice day.